On Thursday, January 29th, we sat down with Evan Falchuk, the head of the United Independent Party. Well, thank you for taking the time to sit down with us today.
Thank you.
First of all, you just ran for governor and came in third. Why is that awesome?
That's a great way of putting it, because it is awesome. What was awesome about it is that we created the new United Independent Party, which was a big part of what we were trying to do. And we need to have a new platform in our politics so that people's voices can be heard. The way it works today with the traditional political parties is that they've managed to tamp down the ability of people to speak out about the important issues that we face. And they've ensconced themselves behind money and unfair rules that keep out outside voices. What we managed to do was to play by those skewed rules and achieve an important victory, which is to create this new party. So awesome is the right word for it.
How goes the campaign to enroll folks?
It's going well. We've been working very hard. What we've been doing is holding United Independent Party organizing meetings all around the Commonwealth. And it's been in various different places, down on the South Shore, up in Lawrence. We had one out in Pittsfield last week. Typically, we have about 20 or 30 people that are there, and we're talking about the policy platform of the party, how to get people enrolled in the party, training people on just the process of going out there and trying to engage people, again, in our political process, and then talking about new things, new initiatives we can work on. It's kind of how the issue of the Olympics, which I was against as a candidate for governor, came so much to the fore. It was because at each one of these meetings, this was a topic that was right there in the forefront in people's minds.
Well, speaking of the Olympics, sort of why are you pushing for a referendum, and what exactly will be the question?
I'm pushing for a referendum because there's been basically silence from our elected leaders or enthusiastic support. And here's the thing about the Olympics. It's a sporting event, and I like sports, but it's also a business, and it's a business that's trying to make money with the support of the taxpayers. And they're not leveling with taxpayers about the extent to which they want to use our money in order to support this business effort. So what alternatives do we have as voters? Democrats and Republicans are pretty much on the same page. The mayor of Boston says no vote. Pretty much nothing coming out of the legislature. Governor says he's looking forward to the exciting opportunity that the Olympics represents. So voters have to be organized, and that's the reason we created the United Independent Party. If you've got that sensation that, the system is set up in a way that's designed to help those that are politically connected get paid off of their connections, well, here's Exhibit A, the Olympics. If we weren't in the forefront of this, you'd say, were you guys serious about all that stuff you said in the 2014 race? That's why we're here.
Okay, and well, who do you think is trying to get paid specifically? Is it just IOC kind of folks, or is there like a local side of it too?
Well, the IOC has a history of making money in these kinds of ways. They're sort of they're just another version of like FIFA for the World Cup. Locally, if you just go to the 2024 Boston website, you can see the list of the people that are backing this. Now, keep in mind, this connected group of people, these are what the Boston Globe called the power elite of Boston. It's a combination of people in the construction industry. You've got union interests, you've got lawyers and lobbyists and lots of other groups that stand to benefit greatly from this, who submitted a bid on behalf of the people of Massachusetts without asking us whether we wanted to do this. And now that we've been picked by the U.S. Olympic Committee, are out telling us that we don't really need to see everything that they've proposed. They dragged their feet for a long time. They still haven't disclosed everything about this bid. We have our elected officials saying no vote. It looks pretty clear to me that they are going to spend a lot of taxpayer money. I saw the head of Boston 2024 say that he wanted to force a conversation about the next 30 years of Massachusetts policy around land use and economic development and housing. And I hear that and I say, no one voted for him. Our process is set up so that there's a legislature, and we've got elected officials who are supposed to be dealing with those issues. And to the extent they're not, it is not incumbent upon private interests that stand to benefit from those decisions to be deciding how our policy gets made.
When you're talking about the head, are you talking about
John Fish.
Oh.
So, for this ballot question you're talking about, is this just going to be about whether taxpayer money is spent, or is it going to be about the Olympics as a whole?
Well, it'll be about taxpayer money. you can't have in Massachusetts something that says, I mean, you could, that says the Olympics are illegal in Massachusetts. But the way that our ballot initiative process works here is you've got to write it like it's a law, because the legislature will actually be voting on it or not, but it'll be placed in front of the legislature. So the model I like to look at is what they did in Colorado back in the early 70s, where they said no taxpayer money, no guarantees in support of those Olympics, and let voters decide. If it's such a great deal for the people of Massachusetts, this is what I always come back to, then the backers you'd think would be out there telling people, hey, this is so incredible. To use your word, awesome. This is the most awesomest thing that's ever happened. Here it is. Can't you believe how exciting this is? But they're not doing that, which says to me that they must know that there's something not quite so awesome about it for taxpayers.
So what about, I know that, like, so they've said so far they don't plan on spending taxpayer money on the Olympics budget itself, but what about these other issues about public resources? Like, they want to use public land, like a volleyball stadium on the common, and I believe the Olympics makes the city agree that they give like a special lane of traffic to the IOC representatives.
Right. I mean,
street.
we've read those. I mean, I've read those stories. Everybody has about the different demands that have been made by the IOC. We haven't seen those yet here in Boston. Although who knows? Maybe that has been one of the requirements. What they've said is $4.7 billion is the operating cost of the Olympics. Good news, that's going to be paid for privately. So they say, but let's take them at their word on this. They said there's another $5 billion of public improvements that they say the Olympics will help us make sure actually happen. But the good news is they say that those were going to happen with the Olympics or not, which doesn't exactly make sense, but that's what they're saying. Here's the problem. What they're talking about is something like $13 billion that was voted on in a transportation bond bill, which has included tons of projects that are probably never going to happen. And what they're saying is the Olympics will be the thing that decides what is prioritized in Massachusetts. And you know that's the way that will work. If we go ahead with this thing and we're picked by the International Olympic Committee, development dollars for transportation, for public transit, for whatever it is that's important, will be preferentially used to support things that have to do with these Olympic Games. They want to build a 60,000 seat temporary stadium. Well, we just had a huge storm here in Massachusetts in which seawalls were breached down on the South Shore. In a world in which the Olympics is our #1 priority, things like the seawall will have to compete against 60,000 seat temporary stadiums for public attention. We have a city of Boston and many communities around the Commonwealth that are struggling with enough money for their schools, programs for seniors and veterans that aren't properly funded. But they're going to have to compete against a Boston Common beach volleyball stadium. This, to me, is exactly backwards the way the process ought to work. Again, if it's such a great deal for voters, explain it in those terms. Tell me why it should be more important than those other priorities. They haven't done that.
So where are you at with the ballot question process?
The way the process works, I mean, we formed a committee for the purpose of organizing it. The United Independent Party is obviously taking a lead role in this. We're working on language. The way it works is that you go to the Attorney General and get the Attorney General to approve the language. There's constitutional requirements of things you can and cannot touch with a ballot initiative. Then come September, you're allowed to start collecting questions once you've gone through that process. So we're at what is the early stages of this process. Interestingly, you've got to go and collect 65,000 signatures in order to get something on the ballot. You've got about 2.5 months in order to do that, so it's hard. It then gets put in front of the legislature. If it doesn't pass it as a law, then you can go out and get another 10,000 or so signatures, and then it is on the ballot in November of 2016. But we're not daunted by that challenge. We think it's important to do. Again, in the absence of anyone actually taking this kind of action that we've elected, it falls upon us, the people, to take these kinds of moves.
And who else is on the committee?
The committee is really the leadership of the United Independent Party. I mean, I'm the chairman of it. It is something we just formed in the last week or so. What we've been doing is building up a pretty interesting group of supporters, and there'll be more news on that in the coming weeks and months, who are working on this, who are saying, I appreciate the fact that people think that the Olympics are a good idea, but the voters are the ones who should decide.
Are you talking to No Boston 2024 and No Boston Olympics and those other groups?
I've certainly talked to those groups. They were talking about potentially looking at a ballot initiative just in the city of Boston, sort of a non-binding advisory opinion. I do see that they've been in talks with some people in the legislature and even some of the people in Boston 2024. So we'll see how that plays out. What I'm concerned about is anything that turns into an inside game. In other words, there's nothing that someone from Boston 2024 could say to us to make us stop this process. If they said, here's what we're going to do, we're going to be involved in a very diligent public process in which we're actually not going to decide whether or not we're going to move forward with this bid. We might be willing to withdraw this bid to the USOC. Well, that would get my attention. And it should get everybody's attention if they're willing to put themselves out there like that. As it has been so far, they say there's nothing we could hear from voters in the course of this that will make us change our minds. That's what worries me, and I think that's the kind of thing that most voters hear. And they say, so is this a real public process or is this just for show? You know, I went to the first Citizens Advisory Group meeting, which was, I don't know if you were there, but it was in the Boston Convention Center, which was an interesting choice from an optics perspective. That's another project that has cost taxpayers billions. But they put on a very slick kind of marketing presentation. They took a small number of questions that were written from the audience. They didn't give direct answers to a lot of the really significant issues that were raised around security, around how much money was actually going to be spent on these issues, around the importance of these things. But they did say a lot of things, again, about driving the public policy discussion for the next 30 years. Well, that doesn't sound like a true interactive process. That sounds like a one-way, let me sell you story. We don't need that.
Switching gears, can you sort of, what is the party platform? You know, what is the pitch, the vision?
Well, here's where we started with. We want people's voices to be heard. And I think the thing that gets in the way of people's voices being heard today is a political process that seems designed to suppress voter turnout, voter engagement, voter participation, and magnifies those people who are at the extremes on so many different issues. So here's our set of guiding principles, and they're the non-negotiable principles of the United Independent Party. Everybody is equal, everybody's civil rights have to be protected, and the government's got to spend taxpayer money wisely. These are the types of things that most people would say, okay, well, I agree with that. Okay, that's good, but let's make sure that you've got a political organization that says these are non-negotiable for us. What you might find or not surprising in the course of campaigning over the last couple of years in Massachusetts was how many people would say, what do you mean everybody's equal? Okay? And I was surprised when I was first asked that question, and I'd say, well, you know, I read this really cool document called the Declaration of Independence, and it's good. And for all the flaws of our country at the time of its founding, they got that right. Everybody is equal, and it's been something that we've had to live up to in our country over the last few hundred years, and we still have work to do. But the reason we're setting that out there is we're not going to be negotiating people's rights and their inherent equality. That's not going to happen in the United Independent Party. We're done in America in 2014, 2015 with these issues. So we have to continue to move that forward. Spending taxpayer money wisely. Well, I think it's very clear that spending money on Olympics-related things is not wise at a time when we have all these other priorities. And protecting people's civil rights, there's a lot of very important things happening right now in our country around people's civil rights, whether it's got to do with racial profiling or the extent to which surveillance of Americans is happening in incredible ways, to which people have said, well, you know, it kind of is what it is. And that, to me, is what's wrong with our political system and why we need a party that's driven by a fundamental commitment to those values.
All right, so for instance, you're talking domestic spying, NSA, some of the Snowden leaks and
Yep.
whistleblowing. You know, what would you do? What would be, how would you address some of that?
Well, we have a Fourth Amendment in our Constitution, which says that the government's not allowed to search you without getting a warrant. Okay? The NSA is not supposed to be spying on Americans. At least for a very long period of time, the law said you couldn't do that. They ultimately changed it. But what you see is incredible is the continuity, because this started in the Bush administration, it's continued with the Obama administration. The extent of surveillance is happening even down at the state level and the local level is rather remarkable, again, at a time in which there has not been public conversation about this. It was the same thing when they first started this process with the NSA. The feeling was, when you read the accounts of what was going on at the time, was that this stuff was too important to expose to the public, which is sort of like not democracy when you think about it. We could decide if we wanted to give up large amounts of our privacy and civil liberties. We can decide that. We've got an ability to do that as Americans to an extent, right, within the limits of what the Constitution allows. But we've not been afforded that opportunity with the extent to which this surveillance is happening, and we still don't know the full extent of it.
So, like more specifically though, what about our state what could the United Independent Party do about surveillance on the state level?
Well, there should be legislation around these things. So what has tended to happen at the federal level and here at the state level, it was happening last year, the Attorney General was seeking expanded wiretap authority. And this was happening not through legislative means, but there was going to be a rulemaking process for doing this. We have broad bipartisan agreement in our country and in our state that this is good stuff. Expanded wiretap authority, bring it on. There might be a terrorist out there somewhere. And what they want us to do is to say, listen, to question these things is unpatriotic. So, for example, in one of the televised debates, I said, and this was as strong a statement as I made in the course of that debate on this issue, that I was concerned about the militarization of the police. That's it. Concerned. And frankly, I would be surprised if anybody's not concerned about that on some level. And a columnist for the Boston Herald described me as a result as Comrade Falchuk. Comrade, okay, so I'm a communist for being concerned about it. Now I'm wearing communists don't usually dress like this, and they're not. I'm just an American who thinks that Americans, this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. And brave means that I should be able to feel comfortable walking down the street where I live without saying, you know, I'm too scared to go outside unless I know that the government is surveilling me and everybody around me so that they can know who are the bad guys. Because that's not what America's all about. To me, that's not what it's about. So we should have a very open, transparent process when you've got people that we elect that are brave enough to say, you know, I'm worried about this. This makes me uncomfortable. And it shouldn't be the kind of thing where what we see happening, like when you saw many of these revelations about the NSA on a national level, that there were Republicans saying, I trust the government. Republicans. You know, these are the people that are supposed to be the ones who are saying, listen, don't trust the government. Well, they're the ones who are telling us all, trust me. That should always be not to use another communist illusion, a red flag. Look out when you've got people in government saying, trust us. The point of our country is that we're happy to trust you, but show us that you should be trusted. Now, let me say one other thing. The people that are working in law enforcement and in our military and in our intelligence services are, for the most part, good people who are trying to do the right thing in a difficult environment in which the stakes are really, really high. But I think the extent to which we've got a political class, a political elite that is afraid to talk about these issues in direct and real ways is the most serious threat when it comes to security.
I think last year, the ACLU of Massachusetts, they had 3 privacy laws they were pushing for. One was, I think, regulation of drones. There was the license plate readers, the things that the cops use that take pictures of everybody's license plate. And there was a third one, which I can't remember at the moment, but they're all privacy related. Are you familiar with those, and is that something that your party would get behind?
The third one was to do with getting warrants for electronic communications.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I don't have those in front of me, and I do remember each of those things, and those are the types of things that we should be talking about. But think about this. So if you say, what is the United Independent Party about? Always come back. Everybody's equal. Everybody's civil rights have to be protected. Government's got to spend taxpayer money wisely. So those issues that you've just raised, they implicate at least 2 of these things. At least 2, probably 3. If you're taking pictures of everybody's license plate, there's a civil rights issue here that we should be able to talk about and decide whether we want to allow for that to happen. There's also a taxpayer money issue, you know, sifting around through hundreds of millions of photographs of license plates. Again, what are we looking for exactly, and why should everybody give up their privacy as to where they are and where they've been? But we could make that decision. And then, of course, the equality. I mean, you worry about the extent to which profiling comes into play around a lot of these things. These aren't easy issues, and they should not be yes, no answers. But it shouldn't be that law enforcement says, here's what makes our life easy, and that becomes the thing that we should do because it's convenient. Again, that's the whole point of having a constitution, is that we should be able to draw the lines on these things.
Yeah, they don't really have to say anything. They just kind of can do it.
They can just do it. And again, there's an extent to which you might say, all right, well, we're willing to live with that. But tell us.
Right, yeah.
And give us a chance to say no.
That seems to be kind of key to a lot of these things, is sort of open and transparent government. What would you do in Massachusetts to make it more open, more transparent, more responsive?
Well, think about, there are so many basic things that aren't open and transparent. So, for example, there's huge amounts of money that's spent by our government. We actually don't have access to how it's spent through these quasi-public agencies. By the way, the backers of the Olympics want to create quasi-public agencies to run some of the construction and other land acquisition projects. So unless they're going to change the rules around that, this should again be another red flag. But when it comes down to issues of how we surveil people in Massachusetts, the lack of transparency around those things is rather striking. I know that the ACLU has done some very interesting work around the extent to which protesters are photographed in the course of just exercising their First Amendment right to not only speak but to protest. I can't figure out exactly what valid law enforcement purpose there would be to taking pictures of people that are just out doing this, unless they're trying to put together a database of people who protest against government action. Well, this is not a comfortable thing. And to the extent the government is doing that and not explaining why it's happening, what it's for, how the information is being used, we have a problem with transparency. Now, again, I fully appreciate the extent to which there has to be a degree of secrecy around certain things that our government does. There has to be. But again, as voters and as citizens, we should be able to make an informed decision of, you know what, I got it. I understand that there are launch codes for nuclear missiles in the United States military, but I don't think it would be appropriate for every voter to know what those launch codes are and understand how to input them into the system. I think that's too far. All right, but at least I've got enough information to be able to make that decision. All right, and again, there are many things that aren't as ridiculous as that example where we should be able to say, listen, yeah, we're taking pictures of this particular protest because we understand that there's 4 people that we've been investigating as part of a terrorism investigation who are attending it, and we want to see who they're with because we're trying to put together a case. That's interesting and reasonable and fair, and there should be an ability for that kind of probable cause to happen. But the dragnet sweeps of Americans, which is what is pretty much characterizing this, is very convenient for law enforcement. If something happens, they can say, hey, look, good news, we've got pictures of every single person that was there. And if not, it's all right, good news, we have pictures of every single person that was there. And what are they going to use that for? Now, we're lucky because we're living in a time where we do not have a malicious government, I don't think. But if we ever were to have that again is the reason why our founders created this Constitution, to make sure that if there were a malicious government intent upon doing ill to the people, that they would be protected.
Sure, let's talk about the NDAA.
Right, no, fair enough. You can have those kinds of, but that's a really a good example of that too, where you say, so what's really happening? There has been an ability for the public to jump in and have something to say about this, which ends up affecting policy. I think the extent to which many elected people just aren't versed in a lot of these subjects makes them vote in ways that they might say, yeah, this makes sense because I've been lobbied on this by someone on one side, and the other side looks a little bit cranky, and I'm going to vote on this side. I get a lot of money from these people. This is the trouble we have.
But outside of just law enforcement, I'm thinking, the public records law. I believe
it's a great example.
There's somebody who's working to update it, and I can't remember the name at the moment, to try to put a little bit more teeth into the law so that you can actually get a public records request to go through. Yeah,
it's a great example. I mean, the public records requests are the source of so many amazing things that you find out about what the government has been up to. And it's part of being an informed citizenry, is that you've got to have the right to get access to these materials. The thing that Marty Walsh signed around the Olympics, saying that no one who's paid by the city of Boston can speak ill of the Olympics and in fact has to actively promote it, that wouldn't be known about if someone hadn't filed a Freedom of Information or public records request to get that kind of data. I've also seen situations where groups like the ACLU want to get data about traffic stops, and they're told they need to pay some huge amount of money in order to get those records put together. Well, that's basically preventing the records request from going forward. So there has to be much more transparency. That's why I'm saying a lot of this stuff is at a very basic, fundamental level. We also have to get at these more complicated issues, like how do we draw the line around the surveillance and other issues that are like it. But you're right, at the basic level, a lot of these things should be taken care of, but they're not. And you know something, we've got a bad history of this in Massachusetts. Our elected officials do not like to reveal information. And they like to do things behind closed doors. They like to be able to say we don't need the scrutiny of the people over the work that we're doing. And that's a culture that is not going to change because both the traditional parties have that same view.
Would your party have that view?
No. I mean, look, and I don't, obviously I'm going to say this because we're sitting here together, but if you look at the way that we've run the campaign or the way that we do interviews like this one, I don't know what you're going to ask me about. And that's how we operate. I've been in plenty of situations, and I can tell you there's plenty of people in politics today that would not sit down with a group that says, hey, you know what we're about? We're about transparency and openness in government. So we're going to ask you some pretty uncomfortable questions. And and expect that the person's going to actually sit there and answer them. There might be a staffer sitting there. Emily's doing some other work right now. She's not even listening to me, which is okay. But they'd be sitting there saying, I'm going to take notes, and I'm going to make sure afterwards I'm going to get on the phone with you to say, listen, when he said he was concerned about transparency, what he meant was he thinks it should be less opaque, but not fully transparent. You say, it would be that kind of a game. Well, that's not, to me, the way that we do these things. But what can you do? You know, it's as voters, we have to be able to see these candidates, find out what they're all about, see how they act, understand that running for office is a job interview, and that everyone's on their best behavior in a job interview, and try to sort through it all. But when candidates hide and don't do debates and don't want to show up to public forums, won't do tough interviews, well, then we never really get to see that, do we? What else you got? Super Bowl predictions.
So you said you plan on running a bunch of candidates in the next election. Do you have any of those people picked out yet, or?
We don't have them picked yet. There'll be a process for that. We've had a couple dozen people that have come to us that said they wanted to run. I don't know that those people will necessarily be the ones, but we're trying to pick. There's a couple ways to look at this, just so you can understand our thought process. You could go and run 200 candidates. Be one way to do it, and I don't doubt that it would be possible to do that. Or you pick races where you've got smart, independent-minded, winnable candidates. We're not looking to go and pick up a few points here or there. We want people who can win and get into the legislature. This has to be the second party in Massachusetts. This has to be the source of accountability for our government, and we need to bring people in who are like-minded, who want to try to do the right things, and who are uncompromising in their belief in those ideals that I stated.
Do any of the people that have come to you, are any of them, do they have political experience?
Yep.
So are any of them people who have come from, say, the Republican or Democrat party?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are people that have been Republicans, they've been Democrats, they've been unenrolled. It's an interesting combination of people, and it actually reflects the kind of eclectic mix of views that reflects ordinary people. The world's complicated, and once you can get past the idea that everybody's equal and everybody's civil rights have to be protected, you can have a really interesting conversation about pretty much every issue under the sun. So you could have people that talk like me about some of these issues around, privacy and surveillance. And you could have people on the other end saying, look, we need to have, there's a reason why we need to have these things. And you can have a really good conversation about it. You could have people that would say, listen, I believe we need to be spending significantly more to support our schools and significantly less on big tax breaks for big companies. And people that say, look, you need some of these tax breaks and you need not quite as much money as you think for the schools. But that's democracy, and it's hard, and it's self-government, but we should be having these kinds of robust debates, not what we tend to see. If you look at what happens here in our State House, there's 160 members of the House, and the Democrats basically vote with the Democrats, and the Republicans vote with the Republicans. And I don't believe that there is a huge amount of really interesting, ideologically motivated debate around lots of different issues. It's just like, what am I supposed to do this time?
Well, it could be going on behind closed doors, right?
In theory. It could be. It could be. And there are some people, I don't mean to say that every single person, because there are some people that actually try to do what is right on various different issues. But again, very often what we see is lockstep.
So you think your party will have more diverse views than the Republicans and the Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, it does already. It's fascinating. I mean, what's interesting to me is we've had people from the Green Party, libertarian people with us at these meetings, people that are Republicans, people that are Democrats coming to these meetings. They come from different places. What they all can agree on, even if they disagree on some pretty fundamental issues, what they all agree on is the government is not representing the people. The voices of the people are not being heard. And they want to use the system in order to change the system. That it is no longer an option to just sit on the sidelines and say, well, I'm just not going to vote. We have to participate in it. What's been missing has been a platform that can support people like that. So now we're at this very interesting stage of this process. It's like an unwritten chapter in a book. What happens if you create that kind of a platform based on those kinds of ideas that people say they really believe in, and spring it loose on the public, make it possible for people to engage in this process in a constructive way? What happens? We're going to see. I think it's going to be a permanent change to our political process.
So Speaking of our political process, one of the more interesting things in the last few years is the Citizens United and sort of unlimited campaign shadow money. What are your thoughts, and what would your party do about it?
Well, I've called for a long time for a constitutional convention because the Supreme Court's not going to overturn its own decision on this. Congress isn't going to overturn the Supreme Court on this. So the only way for this to change is to have a constitutional convention, which would essentially be to outlaw super PACs. The thing we're facing now in our country is this idea that money is speech, that corporations are people. We saw in the Hobby Lobby decision that corporations actually can have religious beliefs. And part of what courts now have to do is figure out how strongly held those religious beliefs are. And this is kind of through the looking glass, Alice in Wonderland kind of stuff, but it's happening. So the choices we have are to do nothing, which is pretty much where we are right now, to do what they've done in Vermont and California, which is to call for a constitutional convention. You get enough states to do that. There is one, and we could amend the Constitution on that basis. I think Massachusetts should be one of the states calling for it. And in fact, I've challenged each legislator, anytime we hear them talk about, I can't stand the influence of money in politics, well, hey, good news. Why don't you vote for a constitutional convention on this? And I know there was something introduced, I'm forgetting at the moment by who, just recently in the legislature on this. I know it's not going to go anywhere, but at least someone's trying it. There should be a groundswell of that in Massachusetts when you think about how we like to think of ourselves as so forward thinking. So that's my personal view. I can tell you there are people that are in this party that say, listen, I don't think that's the right way to go. I think that what we should be doing is making sure that there's instantaneous disclosure of donations, and that there's just, to the extent we're pretending there's no rules, let's stop pretending and just say there's no rules. That's another way to go. I don't think that's the best way to do it. At the end of the day, I think the best way to do it would be publicly financed campaigns. That way we get away from all this nonsense. But the way it is today, and this is what's a little bit insidious, is that if a large corporation wants to support a candidate, well, they're not allowed to give to the candidate, but now they can create a super PAC. So now there's the defense contractor super PAC, and they can go do that, and the money is spent in behalf of the candidate, or in the case of Massachusetts, the super PAC spent more money than the parties and the candidates. And Charlie Baker had about $9 million spent on his behalf by the Republican Governors Association. We don't know where that money came from exactly. So there's this sort of mystery of where does it come from versus instantaneous disclosure. All right, I could see that. But in my mind, make it publicly financed. Just get all this off the table. Let's make sure we get the right people in there, that they're there for the right reasons. Let the public have a good sense of who are you and what are you all about, and not this kind of certainly appearance of corruption.
For your candidates who are running, since you have a party that allows, and I think it's cool, all kinds of diverse stances on just various issues, is there any plan to have them do sort of a positions thing that's successful? Accessible, something maybe online? Yeah,
I mean, we have. Oh, you mean for people to write things in?
No, I mean for folks who run under your party platform.
Yep. So we have online, we've got a what we believe section with a very detailed set of positions on things. In fact, I would say more so than what you see from the two traditional parties.
Sure, but that's the party. You're saying that individuals within the party have their own set of just very divergent sort of thoughts on things.
They can.
Right, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
But will that be spelled out? I mean, like...
Yeah, if you want the support of the United Independent Party, you're going to have to be a pretty transparent candidate. And so if your view is instantaneous disclosure, no campaign finance limits, then say so. You may have a hard time getting the support of a lot of people in the UIP if that's your position, but that's democracy, you see? So I want this to be a party where there are things that we believe in that are non-negotiable. And but there are that everything else you can have a really good conversation about, and that's democracy. What's happened today is that our politics has been taken over by people that want to argue about those non-negotiable things. Look what happened. The Republicans took over Congress, and one of the first things they decided to do was pass a law around abortion, okay, to honor the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. This is their first move. And you say, all right, you know what? They can win elections and raise money by operating in that manner. But it's 2015, and the time to debate this issue is past. Let's move forward. They continue to want to make marriage equality an issue. This is something that's collapsing, the lack of equality in states all around the country. So it's time to move forward on this and to make sure that everybody's civil rights are protected. You saw what happened with this issue of racial profiling, the Black Lives Matter protests. And, I frankly didn't agree with the idea of blocking the highways, those protesters that went and did it. But you see what's happened in our political process. So now, instead of talking about the issue of racial profiling and how to make sure that we have a good oversight into what our police are doing, what we see is them moving quickly to pass bills to increase the penalties on blocking highways. And it's a really unfortunate thing, but you could predict that this is what was going to happen, that something would happen and it would divert attention away and it would allow us to say, okay, you know what, we're done. We've solved this issue. I know that there are people being profiled, but you know what we did? We passed a law to make it a felony to block a highway. All right, now this is not logical, but this is the way it works. But this is one of the things that happens when we lose sight of the core principles of what our politics should be about.
See, government's responsive, just
Right.
not in the way you want it.
Right.
No. What I mean is there a plan as you start picking your candidates for them to have those independent sort of the parts that aren't part of the non-negotiable parts of
Yep.
somewhere spelled out?
Yeah, they
Okay.
should. They have to. I mean, to me, it's like this is what we're about. It was interesting. So I've been calling for this ballot initiative on the Olympics, and the Berkshire Eagle out in Western Mass said it would be not constructive to do this. They said that it'd be better to try to use the Olympics to force the state to spend more money on projects in Western Massachusetts, which is sort of an interesting approach. But their core point was the process of direct democracy is cumbersome and I forget what the other word was they used. Cumbersome was one of the words that they used to describe direct democracy. So I see that as like, look, I know democracy can be a little messy, and it is a little cumbersome. And I think it's part of the reason why these Olympic Games tend to be in autocratic countries, because it's a lot easier to get things done when you don't have to worry about what people think about things. But that's the nature of democracy, and it is, without question, the best system that's ever been invented. It is the most responsive to the needs of the people when it's functioning properly. It provides us the opportunity to have conversations like this, whereas in some countries, this would be seditious to have a conversation like this. Even here in Boston, if we were, obviously in the 18th century, we couldn't sit here with a video camera and talk about, do we think that it's okay for the British to be occupying our homes? But if we were, this would be something that the king would not look too kindly upon. All right, so we have great freedoms and liberties here that we have to be protecting and be very proud of and to feel very good about. But the extent to which people say, yeah, but it's messy, you say, I know it is, but that's the nature of it. So in the United Independent Party, it's going to be interesting when you have people that are disagreeing on an issue within the same party. But it should happen. It should happen. When you watched in the course of the governor's race, there were people that disagreed a bit on the Democratic side with each other on various different issues. But over time, you saw them all converging around what they thought they needed to say in order to earn the support of that elite group that runs the party. Well, this is, again, not good. There should be more of this kind of push and pull to get the best ideas to the surface.
So, obviously there's a lot of trouble with third parties making breakthroughs. You got enough votes to become an official party in the last election, but not even close to winning. And obviously you really believe in what you're doing. I'm just curious, what makes you think that the United Independent Party will succeed where lots of other third parties have failed?
Well, here's the thing, and what was interesting about this last election is that there were communities where we had 10, 15% of the vote, and this was in a world in which we were coming from absolutely nowhere other than a group of people with an idea, where we were outspent by multiples, where we did not have decades and indeed more than a century of experience as a party, building these kinds of things. We still managed to get in some places 10, 15% of the vote out in the Pioneer Valley, out in Western Mass. So that tells you something about what we're on to. What I'll say is this: I think one of the challenges that third parties have had in the past is that they've been focused on what many people would think of as a fringe ideology. In other words, if you want to be part of our party, you better drink this Kool-Aid. You got to drink this Kool-Aid, and one of the things this Kool-Aid does is make you get really wrapped up in particular issues that you just can't let go of, or you can't come to some kind of compromise on. It's not a good recipe for building a coalition of like-minded people. It is always the case that political victory comes from building coalitions with people, and when you build a coalition, you're going to be in league with people who don't totally agree with you. But that's okay. That's the democratic process. I believe when you study the history of many third-party movements in our country, they've been very fixated on particular issues, and that becomes the biggest barrier to their widespread adoption as major parties. Either they get absorbed into some other party, or they just stay in that kind of fringe place. And that's what we're not here for. We're here to organize and mobilize and build that broad-based coalition.
So is part of your strategy going to be focusing on those particular communities where you got a higher percentage of the vote?
It's part of it. I mean, there's 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. We're really looking everywhere when you look at the way we're doing it. I mean, we leave footprints everywhere, so we're not exactly hiding what we're doing. We make sure we tell people when we're coming that we're going to be there and that we are going to organize and mobilize in their community, and we want their support. So it's everywhere. I have to tell you that in such a close race, when you look all around the state, we were basically at that 3% that was needed everywhere, with the exception of the places that we were significantly above it. And that says something. I mean, of course, there were a few towns where it was less, but when you're in a really close race with the kind of low turnout that we had, where there were millions of dollars spent to essentially drive down voter turnout, and we managed to get that accomplished, it's awesome. But it is the beginning, because I think you're also absolutely right that, okay, fine, so we got the votes that we got to move that number of votes, multiply it by 10. We got time. We got 2 years to that 2016 election, and we're continuing to look and organize. Hard work, determination, you can do a lot of things. Motivated people.
Yeah. So you said, one way to do it, you could run like 200 candidates. It didn't sound like that was the thought. So there's a little bit more of a pick your battles and pick your people, it sounds like. Is there anything maybe on a state government level that you would, I don't know, a position or something like that you would look at as part of your strategy moving forward?
For me or for
the party, actually?
So the elected positions that are going to be up in 2016 is our whole legislature. Now there are municipal races that are going on both in 2015 and I imagine in 2017 in many communities around the Commonwealth. We'll see to what extent we want to be involved in those things. We've got a lot on our plate with enrollments, with the ballot initiative, with the 2016 elections, but we're pretty good at multitasking, so we'll see. We want to be, like I said, the second party in Massachusetts, and that means working very hard and pushing it as much as we can within the confines of what's out there. So no, there's nothing that's off the table. And even this idea of 200 people, if there were 200 really good people, we would do that. We'd absolutely do that. I think that as a business person, you want to make sure you're focusing, make sure you get to the right places, make sure you figure out who your candidates are, and make sure you get out there and hit a home run.
So when you say the second party in Massachusetts, you're referring to beating the Republicans, I assume?
Well, there's about 11% of registered voters are Republicans nowadays in Massachusetts. There's not a lot there. So there needs to be another party in Massachusetts.
So do you see yourself as kind of a more conservative party, or just that you feel that you want to beat them because they're the smaller fish?
It comes back to this idea that the voters' voices need to be heard. And this issue of conservative, liberal, this is one of the challenges that we've got in our politics, is everyone's trying to put everybody into boxes. And if you sit down with my positions and pick whatever issue we wanted to pick and said, okay, so is that a conservative position, is that a liberal position? I do that all the time with people, and to me, the important thing is to say, wow, this thing sounds liberal, this sounds conservative. I had people, look, I'm Comrade Falchuk, who has got conservative positions on some things and liberal positions on others, and some people said it sounded like a Green, some people said it sounded like a Libertarian, and you say, well, hey, guess what? I'm an American, and I have a complicated set of views, just like most Americans do. And so the question of what space are we filling, it's that space that is empty right now of people that want to be responsive to voters, that want to have real positions that are genuine, that are based on what we think is the right answer to it, wherever it falls. And like I said, as we've gone out there, the Olympics is a great one. It's the hottest topic of the day right now. You throw that down there, there are people that are like, wait a second, I like the Olympics. Okay, that's great. Let's have a conversation about it. That's not happening inside of the Democratic or Republican parties, but it is happening with us. So that's the gap that we want to be serving, which is it's pretty much most voters these days. And I believe that is not only possible to do, that it should be done.
Pandering to the cumbersome and messy. I like it.
Yeah, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
But this really is it is inherent in what democracy is all about, because the human experience is a little bit messy. It is a little bit cumbersome. It does not lend itself to perfectly ordered processes. It is not linear. Progress doesn't always move in the most constructive direction. Sometimes it takes many steps backwards. But that's what democracy allows us to, and what freedom allows us to do, is to correct. Because there's always people who have a voice, who can say something, say, no, you're going the wrong direction, and they can convince other people. And I think in general people are good and they mean to do the right things. But what has tended to happen throughout human history is that sometimes power gets concentrated among people that may not necessarily share the views of the people they seek to lead. And we're seeing that happen in our country, and everybody knows it. I mean, it seems almost trite to say it nowadays. The question is, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? This sort of endless, oh, we went to the left, now let's go off to the right. Now let's go back to the left again. And you're watching it, you're like, okay, I know how this ends. It ends with us going back the other direction again. And, oh, I know how it ends, in a 2016 presidential election between a Bush and a Clinton. And it becomes almost laughable when you look at it, but you say, well, all right, so now what do we do? What do we do? And the answer is, join the United Independent Party. Go to unitedindependent.org, change your voter registration to United Independent, be part of the solution.
To register to vote?
Yes, you have to register to vote. You have to register to vote. There are too many people that are not, and there are people that say, what does it matter who I vote for? It doesn't make any difference. And I understand where they're coming from when they say that. But when you refuse to participate by not registering to vote, registering is that first step. And I tell people all the time, look, I want you to register and enroll with the United Independent Party. But what I want more is that you register. Just register so that your voice can be heard. Make them listen to you. 2+ million people didn't even vote in this election. How can you possibly be represented in that circumstance unless you're just lucky? The majority of the legislators this year, unopposed, which has become the norm. Again, majority of people don't vote. Majority of people get to office without having to have an opponent. Party's on. So this is the opportunity. This is where we can fill a gap by representing people. But you got to register. I know you're probably registered. You're kidding, but both of you.
Actually, yeah, with my last.
Register. Don't let her leave without a voter registration form.
I'm registered.
Good. Thank you.
So, anything else?
I'm good.
Any thoughts you want to leave us with?
Register to vote. Be part of the system. I'm telling you. People. I don't think most voters realize how powerful they can be if they're organized and mobilized. That how many people out there who are regular people want to get off the sidelines and get involved in the political process. If there's anything that I know we've accomplished, and I drive this home every audience that I talk to, is shown people that it is possible to break into something where they want to keep you out, just by doing the right things, saying what is in your heart, and being genuine. We need to see more of that. Any one of us could act like a politician and say all the things that you're supposed to say and be good at it in some way or another. You know what it would sound like to listen to a typical politician talk. But what does it sound like when we liberate people to have a platform to involve themselves who otherwise don't see a way in? What kind of changes can really happen? I think a lot of them. Lowering the cost of living, all this really important stuff that doesn't happen because people are lining their pockets. This is what we can take on. So,
Thank you very much.
unitedindependent.org.
Thank you for your viewership, and if you found this reporting valuable, please like and share it. You can find more of our reports on BayStateExaminer.com. Links to our website, Facebook page, and Twitter are on the channel banner, and please consider donating so we can continue to expand our coverage.